we'll have a few stragglers coming back from lunch. I guess there's some spirited discussions going on. But I think we should go ahead and get started. And our first speaker of the afternoon will be Don Thibeau of Open ID Foundation to talk about the great standards work they're doing there and how it applies to consumer identity and PSD2 and various other regulations. So, Don?
Thank you. So, if there is any one notion that I can suggest to you, it's the notion of from the CMA to the MAS, from the UK to Singapore. And I'll start out with an outrageous proposition that if you want to understand identity and banking and blockchain, there is no better place to be than Singapore. And I'll make that argument. So what I'd like to do is to take you on a journey of where the identity system, ecosystem, as we understand that, is its most active. And there's a lot of topics to talk about identity, but I'm going to talk about one particular aspect of identity, and I'm going to use one way of prioritizing it, which is called in the US the Willie Sutton rule. So Willie Sutton was a great bank robber. And one day someone said, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And he said, "That's where the money is." So if you say to yourself, why should I think about identity or blockchain? The answer is, that's where the money is. So let's take a journey together. Okay, let's try and do this. And this is, oh yeah. So what I'd like to do is to take you on a journey of where open banking is reshaping the identity ecosystem and where banking itself is changing. So we'll go from beginning to end using what's called open banking in the US. So, bankers hate change. I'm sure there's some bankers here. The only reason that bankers make changes is when they're forced to. A year ago at this time, the Competition Markets Authority in the United Kingdom said to the banking community, if you don't regulate yourself, we will. If you don't open up banking to competition from fintech startups, from non-traditional banks, etc., we'll create a new set of regulations that will require you to do so. The UK government wants to have a much richer ecosystem of banking and financial services. And the UK government, like the Singapore government, knows that its most valuable economic asset is its financial services industry. And the thing that is most characteristic about the United Kingdom and Singapore is that that financial services industry is both a creature of and dependent on a global banking infrastructure. So changes in London affect Singapore as it does New York, etc. So what I'd like to do is to talk about how those changes are occurring from an identity perspective. The identity standard of choice, the most agile standard for how we build a stack of technologies, is now clearly the OpenID Connect standard. It used to be SAML, and many installed industries still operate on SAML, but SAML is an oil tanker. OpenID Connect is a speedboat. What it does is that it provides an open standard for identity so that you can reshape your identity system in order to meet new privacy requirements, in order to combat new security threats, and most importantly, to maintain a level of interoperability that is required in financial services and for identity systems at large. Anything that crosses a boundary really requires the use of open standards. So the open standard of choice in identity is OpenID Connect. If you're a Google user, if you're a Microsoft user or Yahoo, etc., you're using OpenID Connect. What's interesting about standards is that they result from a team of rivals, from competitive pressure. So if we think about open standards, we should think about the exception to the rule. There are two primary exceptions to the rule of open standards in our ecosystem today. One is Apple. Steve Jobs famously said, standards are for losers. So his vision for Apple was a completely integrated vertical stack, a walled garden. Same thing is true of Facebook. So if you have tremendous market power, you don't need standards. But if you are going to interoperate, if what you do is highly dependent upon what others do, you need open standards. If you are Google, you know that you have to interoperate with Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera. If you are in a post-Brexit UK, or you live in Singapore, you're part of a highly interdependent economic financial services infrastructure. So if you live in Singapore, and if you work in banking or financial services, standards are really important because they provide the basis for interoperability. OpenID Connect came about as a result of almost 6.5 years of debate among technology teams from all of these companies. None of these companies wanted to work together. Many of them hate each other. But in order to increase the addressable market, to introduce new products and services to adjacent markets, you need to build on standards. As a matter of fact, Facebook was part of this effort. Until the very last moment, they decided to tweak the standard so that it would become a proprietary one. So Facebook Connect is a lot like OpenID Connect, only it's not interoperable. So the effort that created this community was based on the interest in building something that they could not build by themselves. The power of the OpenID Connect standard is that it allows for innovation and evolution in different industries. So we have today powerful work groups that are using this base standard for mobile connect. So we're taking the identity standard of choice and we're applying it to the platform of choice, the mobile device. We're taking government's assignment of citizen identity and building it on a basis of OpenID Connect. We're working with the most difficult problem set in the US, which is our healthcare system, but we're building that on top of OpenID Connect. I'll be spending a lot of time in this presentation talking about the financial API, which is built on top of OpenID Connect. So, the standard is only as good as its adoption. And its adoption is only as good as its trustworthiness. We live in an increasingly less trustworthy internet, where best practice is you trust no one. That's the world we live in. So how can we build trustworthiness into the work that we do? And by trust here, I don't mean the feeling you get from your grandmother. What trust here is the reliability and repeatability of an experience. So how do we know in this global ecosystem with hundreds of thousands of organizations using the standard, how do we trust that a company in Singapore is implementing the standard in a consistent way as a company in Japan, or a company in the States, or a company in South America? How do we enforce that trustworthiness? How do we ensure that that reliability and repeatability of experience occurs? So we created at the OpenID Foundation a notion called self-certification. Now, many of you will look at that as kind of an oxymoron. Wait a minute, how do we do self-certification? Why do we do self-certification? Traditionally, we've looked at the big four, at auditors and different auditing regimes to provide that. But if we want a trusted ecosystem that scales on a global basis, that crosses boundaries, we need something that is lightweight, low cost, but highly reliable. So self-certification is a tool that provides for that trust. How does that happen? How is it that we now have 300 companies and several thousand implementations of OpenID Connect be trusted? We can't call the blue helmets in from the UN if somebody's not correctly implementing the standard. We do three things. We ask every implementer, every developer of OpenID Connect to look at the standards and take a test. The test is available to anyone at any time at no cost. So companies all over the world are taking this test and looking at the results. If they pass the test, we ask them to post the results of their test, how their deployment uses this technical standard in a correct way. We have the test, we have the results of the test, and that does two things. You can imagine that the very first time that ForgeRock posted the results of its OpenID Connect self-certification, that its competitors went through line by line of that code, making sure that their competitor correctly implemented OpenID Connect. The second thing happened. A global crowdsource of developers looked at the ForgeRock and the Ping and the Google and the Microsoft results to make sure that they were correctly implementing the standard. So we have a peer review, we have a crowdsource review, and then we asked one last thing. We asked the company that was self-certified to put online the most valuable asset that they had, their brand. So we have an officer of a company publicly testifying that those results that their company has posted reflect that company's accurate statement. Peer review, crowdsource, and this legal self-attestation. It's turned out that it works really well. That it's a trust tool in an increasingly untrustworthy internet environment. So the notion of having a standard, having it widely adopted is great, but you want to have it highly trusted. So we came up with this new trust tool to accompany the standard. It's not to say that self-certification is replacing traditional third-party certification. Clearly they complement each other. But increasingly, if we have internet-scale deployments, we need to come up with tools that provide trust, high integrity, at a low cost and low overhead. So the open standard with self-certification is beginning to give us the kind of interoperability that highly independent systems require for this global ecosystem of financial services and identity management systems. So again, there are two different tool sets now for trust in the environment. So, as I mentioned, this notion of self-certification is now being adopted by different industry sectors. So if you go to the GSMA Mobile Connect Mobile Connect is built on top of OpenID Connect. So 850 mobile network operators around the world use Mobile Connect, which is a profile of OpenID Connect. They use that because the reliability and repeatability, the trustworthiness of the standard can be proven by a self-certification test. Again, we're looking at trust tools in an increasingly zero trust environment. So what's another trust tool? So we have a trust framework. And what's a trust framework? Well, it turns out that for many of you that are developing identity systems at scale, it's not enough to build the technology. You have to build the governance that goes with that technology. Why is that? Because technology today and the kinds of systems that you're building, whether you're in financial services or identity management, by definition cross borders. So if we have a system that crosses borders, we need to have a legal agreement that sets out the rules of the road. Because we want everybody involved in the system to be using the same set of rules. Both technical code, but also legal code. And the job that you have before you as developers, as architects, and business managers is that while you are developing your technology, the software code that drives the systems that are in financial services or in government systems, you have to align the legal code with the technical code. Because only then do you have a system that can scale, a system that can be truly trustworthy. So a trust framework is a very simple thing. It's a contract. And like all contracts, it sets out 3 sets of requirements. The business requirements, the technical requirements, and the legal requirements. And like any contract, as my friend Alan was saying at lunch, contracts anticipate the day when things go wrong. All big systems, we all know it, will go wrong in some way. So we have to protect ourselves so that we can understand that each element of the framework understands what they are to do, how they are to do it, and what happens if things go wrong. If you want to stop an identity system project in its tracks, raise your hand and say, what about liability? Because we need to have built into the system a pre-negotiated set of understandings about who's responsible for it. And if things break, who's liable to fix it? So by setting out in advance in a trust framework, we do several things. We guarantee functionality and interoperability because the trust framework will specify what are the standards that are to be used by the participants in the framework. We allow ourselves for the system to scale because if we have a contract where the terms and conditions, the business, technical, and legal requirements are well known and available to everyone, that means that you can scale that contract. So a contract that starts on a bilateral basis between Google and Microsoft can be extended by anybody else that's willing to take on the same liabilities, willing to build with the same standards, and willing to understand what the business rules of the roads are. The other thing that that does, it provides trust. Again, there's that word trust. I'm not talking about grandma, I'm talking about business. And what business means in this context is the reliability and repeatability of an experience at a high volume, a high velocity, and a variety of applications. So if you're in Singapore, you have to build highly trustworthy systems because your market is the globe. And the globe has all different kinds of actors. But what Singapore has to do in the same way that the post-Brexit UK has to do is be seen as a highly trusted place to transact. And the most sensitive transactions are financial services transactions. And the most sensitive of those are international financial services. The other thing is that we want to be able to get products out fast. And the way to move products out fast is that you negotiate the contract once and then have many people join the contract, rather than do bilateral contracts. So a trust framework gives you these 4 benefits that are critical for international systems to be deployed and to be trustworthy. Again, all a trust framework is a contract. It's a multi-party contract. So it exists within 3 sets of rules. So just as software engineers are coding the system, so too are your lawyers looking at the applicable legal code for the trust framework to exist in. So what we can do is we can map liability. And if we can map liability, we can do business together. Because what we've done is we've said how we're going to interoperate from a technical point of view, what the rules of the roads are, and what happens when things go wrong. So open standards and a trust framework and a self-certification regime are the constituent parts of the kinds of systems that we're talking about in identity and access management, and are particularly important when it comes to financial services on a global scale. And I'll submit even more so when we begin to talk about blockchain and DLT technologies. So again, we've talked about liability. We've talked about the importance of what Steve Jobs used to call concurrent engineering, is that while we're building a system, we're having the engineers talk to the lawyers, and the lawyers talk to the marketers, so that when we're deploying a system, it can move to the market quickly, and it can cover a global market. What we do at OIX is very simple. We try and help our members understand this new way of doing business. We have a member called the Open Banking Implementation Entity. These are the 9 major banks in the UK. They have 2 jobs to do. They need to create a new technical standard, an API for open banking. And they need to wrap around that open banking standard a trust framework. Now, I began by saying, how do we get from the Competition Markets Authority in the UK pushing its banks to go first? Why do they have to go first? Because the UK, post-Brexit, anticipates that they have to be interoperable with PSD2 in Europe. Bankers hate this stuff. What they want to do is give me my standards, give me my requirements, and let me do that once around the world. Don't make me go to every single country and come up with an answer specific or bespoke to every different regulator. So the 9 major banks, forced by the Competition Markets Authority, have joined OIX to create a trust framework that will describe how OpenID Connect in a financial API profile will be the basis for a new way of thinking about identity and banking in the UK. It will allow more control for the user to take its banking relationship from Barclays to Mint.com, or from Barclays to HSBC. So by government action pushing the banks into this new way of thinking, the banks are trying to do 2 things at the same time. They're trying to provide better choices for its citizens. It's trying to incentivize innovation by new fintechs and other entrepreneurs in this space. And it's trying to maintain its place in a global ecosystem for financial services. So a whole bunch of ideas, not boiling the ocean, but boiling different ponds are represented in each of these white papers. We're fortunate enough to have a number of EU grants for the EU in trying to build a common market, a common digital framework, wants to be able to look at what they see as an emerging market of cross-border trust services. So the EU, like the post-Brexit UK, and like Singapore, led by the MAS, is looking and reimagining a global ecosystem with this identity plumbing that's going to be serving financial, it's going to be the basis for financial services of the future. Registration. So we've done a lot of analysis about how do we, again, introduce another trust tool into the system. Traditionally, people have used trust marks. And trust marks are really useful if you're selling a toaster. The toaster is here, it has a mark that says it's been tested by a lab, and that it's a good toaster. The problem with trust marks at internet scale is that the first thing the bad guys do is they fake the trust mark. So as we saw with Trustee's business case evaporated because each time the trust mark was on a web page, the bad guys would replicate that trust mark on the phishing site. So how do we have trustworthiness at internet scale so that different actors in different jurisdictions can trust an environment? So we've created a registry. It can be as simple as, here's a white list of good guys. And in that white list of good guys, we can find, in this case, what Google deployment of OpenID Connect for Gmail at what time was tested by these folks in this way. So we can have, with a high level of granularity, a centralized place where trust frameworks from many different industries can be collaborated, can be centralized, so that we can go to one place and see what companies, what organizations are part of which trust frameworks, and what kind of certification was part of that framework. So we have, in an experimental basis, a OIXNet, which is simply a trusted place for trust frameworks. We don't have our own. We let the market decide. We let our members do it. So here we have an example of some of the companies where you can click on each of these and find out how they've implemented OpenID Connect, what their self-certification results were, and how they can be trusted. Let's do a use case. Open banking, we talked about it. We have to move from a traditional banking environment to an internet scale one. We have talked about that governments and industry are driving these standards, and that we have talked about a global domino effect. What starts in the UK in open banking is deliberately front-running what's happening in the PSD2 directive in the EU, which will be adopted by the Japanese banking authorities as soon as PSD2 is done. What's happening in Singapore is that your government is anticipating these new standards and then adding the third element, blockchain. So uniquely here in Singapore, your government, through the MAS, is understanding this global interdependency of identity systems and banking systems and beginning to look at how this is happening. So what we do at OIX is open these learnings up to the world. White papers, projects, different tests as parts of these systems are all available to anyone at any time at no cost on our website. We will be publishing the test case of open banking in the UK so that it can inform European decision makers, so that the Japanese banking authorities and the government here in Singapore can begin to understand how blockchain and DLT technologies can be applied as another trust tool in this environment. So this is what we do. We're really important in that we are all about identity across industries. So we work with not only the banks, HSBC and Barclays is on our board, but we also work with the International Airline and Travel Association. We work with British Air. We have a project here in the Changi new airport where you have a fascinating identity experiment. Where in one place, you have a shopping mall, you have a casino, you have a hotel, you have an airport. Think about the identity management and access issues there. So these are our members. This is what we do, and I would be happy to take questions.
So we have time for a question?
Sir?
The standard for open internet that has been extended to banking platforms, do you think that is something that the healthcare organizations can also leverage? Because I see a lot of mismatch between the standards in healthcare, between sharing information of patients and doctors.
Healthcare is by definition highly regionalized, highly nationalized. Our healthcare system in the United States is not something that anyone wants to be part of. But by definition, financial services, as they meet identity management, is by definition a global community effort. So that's why you have different profiles for government, for healthcare, for the mobile network operators, and for the banks.
Not just that use case you just mentioned right at the end.
Sure.
Is that January 2018 publication? The banking one, slide 29.
We are going to publish that at the end of January.
Right.
Because the deadline for submission to 9 major banks to Her Majesty's Government's Competition and Markets Authority is due on January 13th.
Right, okay. And then there's no conflict or anything for...
Oh, there'll be conflict forever. Don't think it's not going to be this easy. What's going to happen is the Europeans are going to begin to try and influence the Brits,
Right.
and the Japanese are going to be trying to front-run what happens in PSD2. So 2018 is going to be a circus of politics and programming when it comes to open banking on a global basis.
But end of month, yeah.
The great thing we have, and why it's such an interesting time to be in this world and to be in Singapore, is that you have action-forcing events. You have the UK paranoid about interoperability on a global basis. You have the PSD2 directive coming from the EU, and you have bankers here in Singapore, in Japan, knowing that they have to interoperate. And lastly, in my own country, you have a curious thing going on, which is you can't hear anything. So the Secretary of Treasury gave a keynote at an identity conference, which is a big news. He said, look, the Trump administration is still sorting out its environment, but here's what we care about. We care about identity. We think trust frameworks are a really good idea. We think open standards are a good idea. But we want to change KYC, AML, and LEI. What does that mean? No one's quite sure. But that's why 2018 will be so interesting, because for once in a global conversation, the voice in Washington will be diminished.
Not overpowering.
It remains to be seen.
It's true.
Thanks for your time and attention.